In the winter of 1943, somewhere along the frozen spine of the Eastern Front, a man sat behind the wheel of a truck he could not drive. His hands gripped the cold metal rim, his breath fogging the cracked windshield, and behind him, packed into the cargo bed like livestock awaiting slaughter, 17 wounded soldiers groaned and bled into the snow-dusted canvas. The engine idled rough, coughing black smoke into the pale morning air, and in the distance, barely audible over the wind, came the slow grinding rumble of Soviet armor moving through the trees. He had never driven anything in his life, not even a cart, not even a bicycle with confidence. He was a clerk, a record keeper, a man whose war had been fought with pencils and requisition forms in the relative safety of supply depots far behind the lines. But the driver was dead now, his body sprawled in the ditch where the ambush had torn through their convoy, and the only thing separating these bleeding men from capture or death was this idling machine and the 30 miles of broken road that stretched between them and the rallying point. So he sat there, staring at the pedals he didn't understand, the gear shift that seemed designed to mock him, and the steering wheel that felt like the helm of a ship he'd never learned to sail, and somewhere in that moment of absolute terror, something inside him began to change. This is not a story about heroism. It is not about bravery or duty or the noble sacrifices men make for their brothers in arms. This is a story about what happens when a human mind is stripped of every familiar anchor, when the body is thrust into motion it cannot control, and when survival itself becomes the only teacher cruel enough to make a man learn. It is a story about psychological transformation under duress, about the way fear can rewire perception, about how the brain adapts when every neuron screams that failure means death. And it is a story that reveals something darker still, something that military psychologists would spend decades trying to understand and replicate, something that speaks to the very core of how we become competent in the face of absolute chaos. Because what happened to that man in that truck over the course of those 30 miles was not simply learning to drive. It was a forced evolution of consciousness, a baptism in fire and ice, a descent into a state of mind where instinct and intellect merge into something that looks like skill but feels like madness. His name, for the purposes of this archive, was Thomas Keller. 26 years old, born in a small town in Pennsylvania where his father ran a hardware store and his mother taught Sunday school. He had joined the army in 1942, not out of patriotism exactly, but out of the simple certainty that every man his age was going and that to stay behind would mean spending the rest of his life explaining why he hadn't. They made him a supply clerk because he could type and had 2 years of bookkeeping school under his belt, and for a year and a half, his war consisted of carbon paper, inventory sheets, and the tedious choreography of moving material from one depot to another. He had never fired his rifle outside of basic training. He had never seen a man die. He had never been closer to combat than the distant thunder of artillery on quiet nights when the wind blew from the east. And then, in February of that year, his unit was reassigned to support the retreating German forces. Wait, no, that's wrong. To support the advancing American forces pushing through the winter counteroffensive, and suddenly the war was not distant anymore, it was close and loud and hungry. The convoy he was assigned to was supposed to be routine, a simple supply run from one field hospital to another, carrying medical supplies and a small contingent of wounded men who were stable enough to be moved but not healthy enough to walk. 8 trucks in total, rolling through the frozen countryside under a sky the color of old iron. Keller rode in the third truck, sitting in the passenger seat beside a driver named Morrison, a lanky kid from Ohio who chewed tobacco and talked endlessly about the car he was going to buy when the war ended, a blue Ford coupe with white wall tires and a radio that could pick up stations from 3 states away. Morrison drove the way he talked, casual and confident, one hand on the wheel, the other tapping out rhythms on the door frame, and Keller remembered thinking that some men were just born knowing how to make machines obey them, how to move through the world with that kind of easy certainty. They passed through a small village, empty and burned, the blackened frames of houses standing like broken teeth against the snow, and Morrison said something about how quiet it was, too quiet, and Keller agreed but didn't think much of it because everything felt too quiet in winter, the snow-absorbed sound like a blanket over the world. The ambush came without warning the way they always did. One moment the road ahead was clear, just tire tracks and frost, and the next moment the lead truck erupted in flames, a mine or a planted charge that lifted the entire front end off the ground and sent it crashing sideways into the ditch. Before Keller could even process what he was seeing, machine gun fire raked across the convoy from both sides of the road, tearing through canvas and metal and flesh with that distinct chattering rhythm that sounds almost like industrial machinery, almost like something made in a factory rather than designed to unmake human bodies. Morrison slammed on the brakes, the truck sliding on the icy road, and Keller felt the world narrow into a tunnel of noise and confusion, screams from the back, the sharp crack of rifles, the wet thump of rounds punching through the cab. Morrison's head snapped back, blood spattering across the windshield in a pattern like thrown paint, and then he slumped forward against the wheel, and the horn began to blare, a long sustained note that seemed louder than the gunfire, louder than anything. Keller didn't remember getting out of the truck. His mind simply skipped forward, the way memory does when trauma shears away the connective tissue of experience, and suddenly he was crouched in the snow beside the rear wheel, his hands empty, his rifle still sitting uselessly in the cab, and all around him the convoy was being torn apart. Men were running, some toward the tree line, some back the way they'd come, and the machine guns followed them with patient precision, cutting them down in groups and singles. The truck behind them exploded, fuel tank ignited, and the heat rolled over Keller's back like a furnace door opening. He could hear officers shouting orders that no one followed, could hear wounded men screaming for medics who were already dead, and through it all, his mind kept circling back to one simple thought. He had to move, if he stayed still he would die. So he crawled along the length of the truck, staying low, and when he reached the cab he pulled the door open and dragged Morrison's body out onto the road, and the man's face was already going gray, eyes half open and seeing nothing, tobacco juice still dark on his chin. This is what the military would later try to teach. This state of focused dissociation where a soldier can perform complex tasks under fire without being paralyzed by fear or empathy or self-preservation instinct. They would develop training protocols designed to induce it, stress inoculation courses that pushed men to their limits and beyond, hoping to create that same neurological rewiring in controlled environments. But what they would discover, again and again, was that you cannot teach this state, you can only throw someone into it and see if they survive. The brain either adapts or it doesn't, the person either finds the gear or they break, and no amount of preparation can guarantee which outcome will occur. Keller was finding that gear not because he was brave or special or naturally gifted, but because the alternative was death and his nervous system understood that at a level deeper than conscious thought. The truck hit something in the road, a rock or a frozen pothole, and the steering wheel jerked hard to the left, spinning through his hands with enough force to tear skin off his palms. He grabbed it again, pulled it back and felt something in the front axle grind and catch, and for a moment the vehicle threatened to flip, two wheels lifting off the ground before crashing back down. The impact threw him forward against the steering wheel, knocked the wind out of him, and in the back someone started screaming in a high sustained note that didn't sound human. Keller's vision went gray at the edges, not unconsciousness exactly but a dimming of the world, and when it came back a few seconds later he realized his foot had come off the gas pedal, the truck was slowing, the engine coughing and stuttering, and in the rearview mirror he could see something on the road behind them, dust or smoke, something moving. Fear spiked through the dissociative fog like an electric shock. He stomped the gas pedal back down, the truck surged forward with a mechanical scream, and this time without thinking, without planning, his hand reached for the gear shift and pulled it up into what might be second gear. The grinding noise was horrible, metal teeth chewing at each other, but the engine note changed, dropped into a lower register, and suddenly the truck was moving faster, smoother, the steering more responsive. Something in his brain had made a connection, some pattern had been recognized and filed away, and now he knew, or at least his hands knew, that you could shift gears, that you could change the way the machine moved through the world. It wasn't understanding, not in any intellectual sense, it was pure experiential learning, the kind that happens when neurons fire together and wire together, building new pathways in real time. The road ahead curved, a long sweeping left turn, and Keller felt the truck wanting to go straight, wanting to obey the laws of momentum and inertia and carry all that weight and speed directly into the tree line. He turned the wheel, felt the resistance, turned it harder, and the tires screamed on the frozen dirt, sliding, grabbing, sliding again. The truck tilted, leaning into the turn like a ship in a storm, and for one long moment it felt like they were going over, tipping past the point of no return, and then the weight shifted back and they were through the curve and the road straightened out again and Keller's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the wheel. But he held it because letting go meant dying, and something in him, some piece of code written into the meat of his brain by millions of years of survival instinct, refused to let go. Behind him the wounded men had gone quiet, not because their injuries had healed but because they had moved beyond screaming into a kind of shock-induced stupor, the body's way of preserving energy when trauma overwhelms the system. Keller could hear them breathing, harsh and ragged, could hear the wet sounds of blood moving in punctured lungs, but he could not turn around, could not check on them because the road required every fragment of his attention. A signpost flashed by, too fast to read, and then another, and he had no idea where they were or how far they'd come or how far they still had to go. Distance had become meaningless, time had become meaningless, there was only the road and the wheel and the screaming engine and the terrible necessity of continuing forward. Something was wrong with the truck now, some damage from the ambush or the rough driving or both, a shimmy in the steering that made the wheel vibrate under his hands, and a smell like burning oil that crept through the bullet holes in the windshield. The engine temperature gauge, which he'd never noticed before, was climbing into the red, the needle trembling at the edge of the danger zone. He didn't know what that meant exactly, didn't know what he was supposed to do about it, so he did nothing, just kept driving, kept fighting the wheel, kept his foot on the gas because stopping meant being caught and being caught meant death or capture, and both options were unthinkable. The landscape around them had changed, the dense forest giving way to more open terrain, snow-covered fields stretching away on both sides, and in the distance, barely visible through the gray haze of winter afternoon, he could see the dark line of what might be a town or a military installation or just more ruins. The road deteriorated, the frozen dirt giving way to mud and ice, deep ruts where other vehicles had passed, and the truck bucked and pitched like an animal trying to throw its rider. Keller's teeth clacked together, he bit his tongue, tasted blood, and kept driving. His hands were bleeding now, the skin of his palms shredded from gripping the wheel so hard for so long, but he didn't feel it, couldn't afford to feel it, the pain filed away in some mental drawer that would open later, when survival was no longer the only thing that mattered. Part 2. The Road as Teacher. There is a theory in educational psychology, rarely discussed outside academic circles, that the most effective learning occurs when the cost of failure is maximized. In controlled environments, this theory remains largely untested, held back by ethical considerations and the simple reality that you cannot deliberately put students in mortal danger to see if it improves their retention of material. But in war, ethics are suspended, and the experimental conditions right themselves. Every soldier who survives combat has learned something that cannot be taught in any classroom, has acquired skills through a methodology that no training manual would dare to outline. And what Thomas Keller was experiencing in that truck was perhaps the purest expression of this theory, a forced education where each lesson was delivered at survival velocity, where mistakes were corrected not through grades or feedback but through immediate physical consequence. By the time the truck had covered 10 miles, Keller had learned to shift gears, not smoothly but functionally, grinding through second and third with the kind of rough intuition that comes from repetition under duress. He had learned to read the road ahead, to anticipate curves and ruts by the way they appeared in the distance, to adjust his speed before reaching them rather than reacting in panic when they arrived. He had learned to use the steering wheel not as a binary input, not just left or right, but as a variable control that responded to pressure and angle, that could be feathered and adjusted with a delicacy he didn't know he possessed. These skills were not being stored in his conscious memory, not being processed through language or abstract thought, they were being carved directly into his motor cortex, into the cerebellum, into the deep neural structures that control movement and coordination. His body was learning faster than his mind, his hands and feet developing a rough competence that bypassed understanding entirely. But there was something else happening too, something that would not be fully understood until decades later when psychologists began studying the phenomenon of flow states and peak performance. Keller was entering a mode of consciousness where self-awareness dissolves, where the boundary between actor and action blurs into a kind of unified process. Athletes describe this state, musicians encounter it, anyone who has ever been completely absorbed in a demanding task knows the feeling. But in Keller's case, it was not emerging from practice or passion or voluntary engagement, it was being forced into existence by the absolute necessity of continued function. There was no room in his mind for doubt or fear or self-consciousness because all of those processes consumed cognitive resources that were needed elsewhere, needed for the immediate life or death calculus of steering and speed and survival. The truck crested a small rise and for a moment they were airborne, actually lifting off the road, and Keller's stomach dropped as physics took over and momentum carried them forward through empty space. They came down hard, the suspension bottoming out with a metal-on-metal crunch, and the steering wheel was ripped from his hands as the front tires hit the ground at an angle. The truck swerved hard right, sliding toward the ditch, and Keller grabbed the wheel again, pulled it back, but they were moving too fast, the weight shifting wrong, and he could feel the vehicle going over, tilting past vertical. And then somehow, through some combination of luck in the way he turned into the slide rather than away from it, the truck rocked back onto four wheels and straightened out and kept moving. His heart was hammering so hard it hurt, his vision pulsing in time with his heartbeat, but his hands stayed on the wheel, his foot stayed on the gas because stopping was not an option, stopping had never been an option. In the back, one of the wounded men was crying, not screaming anymore but crying in soft hopeless sobs that were somehow worse than the screams. Another man was praying, the words indistinct but the rhythm recognizable, that desperate bargaining with a God who seemed very far away in this frozen hell. Keller heard them the way you hear rain on a roof when you're trying to sleep, present but not quite real, background noise that his brain had learned to filter out. He was alone in the cab, alone in a way that went beyond physical isolation, alone in that space that opens up inside a person when they are pushed beyond what they thought they could endure and discover that endurance has no bottom, only deeper and deeper levels of grim continuation. The sun was setting now, or maybe it had been setting all along, the winter day dying early as it always did at that latitude, and the light was taking on that peculiar quality of late afternoon in wartime, everything washed in shades of gray and pale gold, beautiful in a way that felt obscene given what was happening. Shadows stretched long across the road, making the ruts and holes harder to see, and Keller had to squint through the cracked windshield, had to lean forward and peer through the blood-spattered glass to make out where the road ended and the ditches began. The temperature was dropping too, he could feel it even inside the cab, could see his breath starting to fog, and he realized with a dim sense of horror that if they had to stop, if the truck broke down or ran out of fuel, they would freeze before morning. So he kept driving, kept the engine running, kept the momentum going even though his arms felt like lead and his legs were cramping and every part of his body was screaming for rest. Another mile passed and then another, the landscape unchanging, just snow and trees and the occasional burned-out skeleton of a building. The road forked ahead and Keller chose the right branch without thinking, without any rational reason, just some instinct that told him right was better than left. Later he would wonder about that choice, would never know if he'd made the correct decision or if it mattered at all, but in the moment there was no time for second-guessing, only action, only the endless continuation of forward motion. The truck was making new sounds now, concerning sounds, a rhythmic clicking from somewhere in the engine compartment and a grinding from the transmission that came and went with the shifting of gears. He didn't know enough to understand what these sounds meant, didn't have the mechanical knowledge to diagnose the failures that were accumulating, so he ignored them, or more accurately he filed them away as irrelevant because there was nothing he could do about them anyway. The road began to climb, a long gradual incline that made the engine labor and forced Keller to downshift, grinding the gears again as he tried to find the right configuration. The truck slowed, momentum bleeding away as they climbed, and he pressed the gas pedal to the floor, trying to coax more speed out of the protesting engine. They were crawling now, maybe 15 miles an hour, and every second felt like an eternity, every yard gained felt like a victory against gravity and mechanical failure and the sheer weight of everything that had happened. The wounded men in the back had gone completely silent, and Keller didn't know if that was good or bad, didn't know if it meant they were unconscious or dead or just beyond making noise. He couldn't turn around to check, couldn't afford to take his eyes off the road even for a second, so he drove and hoped and tried not to think about what he would find when they finally stopped. At the top of the rise, the road leveled out and Keller saw something that made his chest tighten with something that might have been hope. In the distance, maybe 2 miles ahead, there were lights, artificial lights, the kind made by generators and military installations, a cluster of buildings and vehicles and the unmistakable geometry of an organized encampment. Relief flooded through him, so intense it was almost painful, and he pressed down harder on the gas, trying to close the distance as fast as the damaged truck would allow. But even as he did this, even as he steered toward those lights with every remaining ounce of strength, some part of him understood that arrival would not mean safety, not really, because safety was an illusion in war, a temporary condition that could be revoked at any moment. What Thomas Keller had accomplished in those 30 miles of frozen road would become a case study, though his name would never appear in the official records, a data point in the massive accumulation of knowledge about human performance under stress that the military was building during those years. The phenomenon he had demonstrated was not unique to him, it was happening all across the theaters of war, men and women being thrust into situations they were not trained for and either rising to meet them or being destroyed by them. But Keller's experience was notable for its purity, for the way it isolated a single variable, the acquisition of a complex skill under immediate threat, and demonstrated that the human brain is capable of learning far more quickly, far more effectively, than any peacetime educator would dare to believe possible. The neurological mechanisms at work during those miles were later studied in laboratories, replicated in controlled conditions as much as they could be replicated without actually putting subjects in mortal danger. Researchers found that stress hormones, when released in sufficient quantities, act as a kind of cognitive accelerant, making neural connections form faster and stronger than they would under normal conditions. Each successful action, each correct steering adjustment, each properly timed gear shift, was being reinforced by a burst of neurochemical reward that carved those behaviors into permanent memory. This is the brain's emergency learning protocol, the way it acquires survival skills when there is no time for gradual instruction or repeated practice. And what made it so effective, so terrifyingly effective, was that it bypassed all the slow methodical pathways of traditional learning and wrote directly to the motor system, creating competence without understanding, action without thought. But this kind of learning comes with a price, and that price is paid in psychological damage that may not become visible until years later. Keller was not simply learning to drive, he was being traumatized, and those two processes were inseparably linked. Every memory he was forming was tagged with terror, every skill he was acquiring was bound up with the visceral sensation of imminent death. This is how PTSD works, not as a failure of the mind but as a consequence of learning too well, of forming memories and associations so strong that they cannot be forgotten or unlearned. The smell of burning oil would trigger flashbacks for the rest of his life. The sound of a grinding transmission would send his heart racing decades after the war ended. The very act of driving, which should have become routine and unremarkable, would remain forever tinged with the emotional residue of that day. The lights ahead were growing larger now, resolving into distinct points, and Keller could make out the shapes of buildings, tents, vehicles parked in rows. The road smoothed out slightly as they entered the perimeter of the camp, and he saw soldiers moving around, carrying supplies, walking between structures with the casual purposefulness of men who were not currently being shot at. The contrast was surreal, this pocket of organized normalcy existing just miles from the chaos and death they had escaped. Keller tried to slow the truck, tried to ease off the gas, but his leg wouldn't respond properly, the muscles locked in the extended position from being held there for so long. The truck was still going too fast as they entered the camp, and soldiers were jumping out of the way, shouting, waving their arms, but Keller couldn't process what they wanted, couldn't understand why they were angry. A sergeant stepped into the road ahead, holding up both hands, and Keller's brain finally registered the need to stop, to bring this motion to an end. He lifted his foot off the gas, stomped down on what he hoped was the brake pedal, and the truck lurched forward, the pedal sinking to the floor without resistance. Something in the brake system had failed, lines cut or fluid leaked away, and the truck was not slowing, was barely decelerating at all. The sergeant's eyes went wide and he dove sideways as the truck barreled past him, and Keller yanked the wheel to the right, trying to steer into an empty space between two tents, but the truck was sliding now, skidding on ice, and the steering had no effect. They hit something, Keller never knew what, hit it hard enough that his head snapped forward into the steering wheel and the world went white with pain. The engine died with a final mechanical gasp, and suddenly there was silence, real silence, broken only by the ticking of hot metal cooling and the ragged sound of his own breathing. He sat there, hands still gripping the wheel, blood running down his forehead from where he'd split the skin above his eyebrow, and slowly, very slowly, began to understand that they had stopped moving. The journey was over. They had arrived. Men were running toward the truck now, soldiers and medics, shouting questions and orders, and someone was trying to open the driver's side door, which had jammed shut in the final collision. Keller fumbled with the handle, couldn't make his fingers work properly, and then the door was wrenched open from outside and hands were reaching in, grabbing his arms, pulling him out of the cab. His legs buckled when they tried to take his weight, the muscles locked and cramping after so long in the same position, and he would have fallen if the soldiers hadn't caught him. They were asking him questions, demanding to know where he'd come from, what had happened, how many wounded were in the back, but the words were just noise, meaningless sounds that his brain could not organize into language. Someone opened the back of the truck and there was a moment of horrible silence, and then urgent shouting as the medics swarmed in. Keller turned his head, tried to see, but his vision was blurry and his neck wouldn't rotate properly. He heard someone say, 3 dead, the rest critical, and felt something inside him crack, some protective barrier giving way, and suddenly he was crying, not sobbing but just tears streaming down his face, silent and unstoppable. A medic was examining him, checking for injuries, asking him if he could hear, if he knew his name, and Keller nodded but couldn't speak, couldn't force words past the tightness in his throat. They led him to a tent, sat him down on a cot, gave him water that he couldn't drink because his hands were shaking too badly to hold the canteen. Someone wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and he realized he was freezing, had been freezing for hours without noticing it, and now that the adrenaline was draining away he was starting to feel everything, the cold and the pain and the exhaustion that went deeper than any tiredness he'd ever experienced. An officer came in, a captain, asking questions about the ambush, about the convoy, about casualties and enemy strength, and Keller tried to answer but the memories were already fragmenting, pieces of experience that wouldn't connect into a coherent narrative. He remembered Morrison's head snapping back, remembered the sound of the machine guns, remembered being behind the wheel of a truck he didn't know how to drive, and then there was a gap, a blur of motion and noise that his mind had not properly recorded. "How did you learn to drive?" the captain asked, and Keller looked at him blankly, not understanding the question. "Your file says you're a supply clerk, no motor pool experience, no training on military vehicles. So how did you drive 30 miles through enemy territory?" And Keller opened his mouth to answer and found that he didn't know, couldn't explain it in any way that made sense. He hadn't learned exactly, he had just done it, had let his body figure it out while his mind was elsewhere, and now he possessed a skill that felt simultaneously concrete and impossible, like a memory borrowed from someone else's life. "I don't know, sir," he finally said, and his voice sounded strange to him, hoarse and distant. I had to. So I did." The captain stared at him for a long moment, then nodded and walked away, and Keller was left alone with the blanket and the water he couldn't drink and the slowly dawning realization that something fundamental inside him had changed, that the man who had climbed into that truck's passenger seat no longer existed, and the man who had climbed out of the driver's seat was someone new, someone forged in motion and terror and the desperate calculus of survival. Part 4. The Aftermath of Transformation. In the weeks that followed, Thomas Keller became something of a minor legend in his unit, the clerk who drove through hell and brought back 14 wounded men, 14 because 3 had died during the journey but the others lived, their survival purchased by his panicked competence behind that wheel. Men would point him out in the mess tent, would whisper about how he'd done the impossible, how he'd learned to drive in real time while being shot at and chased and hunted through enemy territory. The story grew in the telling, as stories do, acquiring details that weren't quite true and losing details that were too mundane to preserve. They said he'd fought off German infantry while driving, which he hadn't. They said he'd navigated purely by instinct, which wasn't quite accurate because he'd simply followed the road and hoped it led somewhere safe. They said he was fearless, which was the most inaccurate claim of all because he had been nothing but fear, pure concentrated terror given just enough structure to function. But Keller himself said nothing, did not correct the stories or accept the praise, just went back to his supply duties as if nothing had changed. His hands healed slowly, the torn skin of his palms scabbing over and then scarring, leaving permanent marks that would make it uncomfortable to grip things tightly for the rest of his life. The cut on his forehead healed faster but left a pale line through his eyebrow that made his face look permanently questioning, perpetually skeptical. These were the visible changes, the external evidence of what had happened. The internal changes ran deeper and would take longer to catalog. He discovered, about a week after the incident, that he could no longer sleep through the night. He would drift off easily enough, exhausted from the day's work, but then 2 or 3 hours later he would jerk awake with his heart pounding and his hands gripping the edge of his cot as if it were a steering wheel. Sometimes he woke from dreams of endless roads and screaming engines, sometimes from dreams of impact and blood, sometimes from no dreams at all, just the sudden violent return to consciousness that felt like being torn out of one reality and thrown into another. The medics gave him pills that were supposed to help him sleep, but they only made him groggy without actually preventing the nightmares, so he stopped taking them and learned to function on 4 or 5 hours of broken rest. He also discovered that he was now, technically, a driver. The motor pool had gotten word of what he'd done and decided that anyone who could pilot a damaged truck 30 miles under those conditions was exactly the kind of person they needed. So they reassigned him, pulled him out of supply and put him behind the wheel of a transport truck, gave him 2 days of actual instruction to formalize the skills he'd acquired through trauma. The instructor, a grizzled sergeant who'd been driving since before the war, watched Keller operate the vehicle and said something that stuck with him. "You drive like a man who's afraid the truck is going to kill him," the sergeant said. "Which means you're the safest driver we've got, because that fear is the only thing keeping you cautious." It wasn't a compliment exactly, but it wasn't wrong either. And so Keller drove, day after day, running supplies and personnel and equipment through landscapes that ranged from devastated to merely dangerous. He drove through rain and snow and mud, through artillery barrages and air raids and the constant low-level threat of ambush. And every time he climbed into a cab, every time his hands gripped a steering wheel, he felt that same spike of adrenaline, that same tightness in his chest that never quite went away. He was competent now, genuinely skilled, could handle a truck better than most of the men who'd been doing it for years. But he was never comfortable, never relaxed, never experienced that casual ease that Morrison had possessed, that sense of the vehicle as an extension of yourself rather than a barely controlled machine that might turn on you at any moment. This was the psychological toll of his forced education, the price paid for learning too quickly under too much pressure. His competence was real, but it was built on a foundation of trauma, and that foundation would never fully stabilize. Other soldiers who learned to drive the normal way, through patient instruction in safe environments, developed a relationship with vehicles that was neutral or even positive. They enjoyed driving, found it relaxing, looked forward to the simple pleasure of being in motion. But for Keller, driving would always be associated with terror and death and the memory of Morrison's blood on the windshield. He was good at it precisely because he could never forget how dangerous it was, could never let his guard down, could never stop anticipating the moment when control would be lost and chaos would return. The incident with Keller did not go unnoticed by the military's Psychological Research Division, a small but growing department that was collecting data on human performance under combat conditions. Some officer in some intelligence office, read the report about the supply clerk who had taught himself to drive during an ambush and saw in it something valuable, something that could potentially be studied and understood and perhaps even replicated. A request came down through channels for Keller to be interviewed by a psychological assessment team, and one cold morning in March he found himself sitting in a tent across from two men in clean uniforms who asked him questions and took notes and seemed intensely interested in the most mundane details of his experience. They wanted to know everything. How long had it taken before he could shift gears? What did he think about while driving? Did he remember making conscious decisions or did it feel automatic? Could he describe the moment when he first understood how to steer, and if so, what form did that understanding take? Keller tried to answer honestly but found that most of what they were asking was impossible to articulate. It hadn't felt like learning, he explained, it had felt more like discovering that he already knew something he'd never been taught. One of the psychologists, a thin man with glasses who spoke very precisely, said that this was consistent with what they were seeing in other cases, that extreme stress seemed to accelerate skill acquisition by forcing the brain to bypass conscious learning pathways and write directly to procedural memory. What you experienced, the psychologist said, is what we're calling traumatic competence. You became skilled not despite the trauma but because of it. The brain, when faced with a survival imperative, can sometimes achieve in minutes what would normally take months of practice. He paused, made a note in his book, then looked up at Keller with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been clinical interest. The question we're trying to answer is whether this process can be induced deliberately, whether we can create training conditions that replicate the psychological pressure without the actual danger. Keller thought about that for a moment, thought about what it would mean to deliberately put someone through what he'd experienced, and then said quietly, "I wouldn't wish it on anyone, sir." The psychologist nodded, made another note, and moved on to the next question. But Keller could see it in the man's eyes, could see that the answer was irrelevant because the research would continue regardless, because the military was not concerned with what individuals wished for or didn't wish for. It was concerned with effectiveness, with finding ways to make soldiers more capable, and if traumatic competence could be weaponized, turned into a training methodology, then it would be. Over the following weeks, Keller heard rumors about new training programs being developed, extreme stress courses that pushed men to the edge of breakdown and then demanded they perform complex tasks. Some of the rumors were exaggerated horror stories that grew in the telling, but some were based on real experiments happening at bases far from the front lines. They were putting pilots in cockpits and simulating emergencies until the men learned to react without thinking. They were dropping infantry into hostile terrain with minimal supplies and forcing them to navigate back to safety. They were creating controlled chaos and seeing who could function within it, and those who couldn't were quietly reassigned to positions where such abilities were less critical. This was the beginning of what would later be called stress inoculation training, a methodology that the military would refine over decades and eventually implement across all branches. The theory was sound, the results often impressive, but what was lost in the transition from spontaneous traumatic competence to deliberate training protocol was the understanding that not everyone survives the process intact. Keller had survived, had become skilled, had brought those wounded men to safety, but he had paid for that competence with pieces of himself that he would never get back. The ease of civilian life, the ability to relax and feel safe, the simple pleasure of driving without fear, all of these were gone, traded away in that 30-mile journey through hell. Part 6. The War Within. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945, and Thomas Keller was among the millions of men who returned home to a nation that wanted to celebrate and forget, to move forward into peacetime prosperity and leave the darkness behind. He was discharged with an honorable service record, a few ribbons that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't been there, and the silent invisible wounds that so many veterans carried. He went back to Pennsylvania, to the small town where his parents still lived, and tried to pick up the threads of the life he'd left behind when he enlisted. But that life no longer fit. The town was the same, the streets and buildings unchanged, but Keller himself had been altered in ways that made normal existence feel strange and uncomfortable. He got a job at his father's hardware store, working the register and organizing inventory, tasks that should have been simple and familiar but felt somehow wrong, too slow, too safe, lacking the edge of danger that his nervous system had been recalibrated to expect. He would stand behind the counter watching customers browse, and part of his mind would be somewhere else, still driving that truck, still fighting that wheel, still anticipating the impact that never came. His parents noticed the changes but didn't know what to do about them. He was quieter now, more withdrawn, prone to long silences where he seemed to be listening to something they couldn't hear. He startled easily, would jump at loud noises or sudden movements in a way that made people uncomfortable. And he wouldn't drive, wouldn't get behind the wheel of a car under any circumstances, would walk for miles rather than accept a ride from someone else. His father asked him about it once, gently, and Keller just shook his head and changed the subject, because how could he explain that the skill he'd acquired in the worst moment of his life had become permanently associated with death and terror, that the very thing he was best at was the thing he could no longer bear to do. The nightmares continued, less frequent than during the war but more vivid, more detailed. He would dream that he was back in that truck, driving through an endless landscape of snow and smoke, and behind him the wounded men would be calling out, begging him to drive faster, to save them, and no matter how hard he pressed the accelerator the truck would only slow down, would start going backward, would slide into the ditch while he fought the wheel. He would wake from these dreams with his sheets soaked in sweat and his hands aching from where he'd clenched them into fists, and then he would lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, waiting for dawn. He tried to court a girl his mother introduced him to, a nice young woman who worked at the library and liked movies and long walks. They went out a few times, dinner and a picture show, and she was kind and patient with his silences and his awkwardness. But when she suggested they go for a drive one evening, take her father's car out to the lake and watch the sunset, Keller felt panic rise in his chest like a physical thing. He made an excuse, said he wasn't feeling well, and walked home alone through streets that felt too quiet, too empty, too far removed from the chaos that had defined him. She didn't ask him out again, and he didn't blame her. There were other veterans in town, men who'd served in different units, different theaters, and sometimes they would gather at the VFW hall and drink and tell stories. Keller went once, at his father's urging, and sat in the corner listening to the others talk about battles and buddies and the things they'd seen. Some of the stories were funny, some were sad, and most were exaggerated, polished through repetition into narratives that had clear beginnings and endings and made some kind of sense. But when someone asked Keller about his service, asked if he had any stories to share, he just shook his head and said it was all pretty boring, mostly supply work, nothing worth talking about. Because the truth was that his defining experience could not be told, not in any way that would make sense to men who hadn't lived it, and even if he could tell it, even if he could find the words, he wasn't sure he wanted to revisit it in that kind of casual social context. Part 7. The Long Road Home. Years passed as they do, and Keller built a life that from the outside looked normal, even successful. He took over the hardware store when his father retired, married a woman named Helen who worked at the post office and didn't ask too many questions about the parts of himself he kept hidden. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and Keller was a good father in his way, present and responsible, teaching them to ride bikes and helping with homework and showing up to school plays. But there was a distance there, a part of him that remained unreachable, locked away behind the walls he'd built around that day in February 1943. He never learned to enjoy driving, but he did learn to tolerate it, to get behind the wheel when necessary and pilot the family car through town with white-knuckled determination. His hands would sweat on the steering wheel, his heart would beat faster than it should, and he would drive 5 miles under the speed limit because anything faster felt reckless, dangerous, too close to the edge of control. His children didn't understand why their father was such a nervous driver, why he refused to take them on long trips or drive on the highway if he could avoid it. Helen understood a little better, had pieced together some of what had happened during the war from things he'd said in his sleep and the way he flinched when trucks passed too close on the road. But even she didn't know the full story, didn't know about Morrison's death or the wounded men or the 30 miles of frozen hell that had taught him everything he knew about driving. The hardware store did well, American prosperity filtering down even to small towns in Pennsylvania, and Keller was known as a reliable businessman, fair in his dealings, honest, never late with an order. Customers liked him or at least respected him even if they found him a bit standoffish, a bit hard to read. He hired employees and treated them decently, paid fair wages, closed on Sundays so everyone could have a day off. On the surface, it was a good life, a normal life, the kind of peaceful civilian existence that millions of veterans had returned home to build. But underneath, in the private spaces of his mind, Keller was still driving that truck, still fighting that wheel, still hearing the screams of the wounded and the grinding of the damaged transmission. The psychological term for what he was experiencing is post-traumatic stress disorder, though that term wouldn't be formally recognized until decades later. In Keller's time they called it shell shock or combat fatigue or just said a man had come back different from the war, and there was no treatment, no therapy, no acknowledgement that these invisible wounds were as real and as debilitating as physical injuries. So men like Keller simply lived with it, carried it, built their lives around and on top of the trauma until it became a permanent part of the foundation, something that was always there but rarely spoken of. He read sometimes in newspapers or magazines about advances in psychology, about studies of learning and memory and stress. Once, in 1957, he came across an article about military training methods, about how the armed forces were using simulated stress to teach complex skills more quickly. The article mentioned something called accelerated competence acquisition, and Keller read it with a growing sense of recognition and revulsion. They were doing it on purpose now, what had happened to him by accident, creating controlled versions of his nightmare and calling it progress. The article said the methods were highly effective, produced soldiers who could perform under pressure with minimal training time. It did not mention the cost, did not talk about the men who broke during the process or the ones who completed it but carried the psychological scars forever. He put the magazine down and didn't think about it for weeks, pushed it away into the same mental compartment where he kept all the war memories, all the things he'd learned to live with but not look at directly. But late at night, when sleep wouldn't come and Helen was breathing softly beside him and the house was quiet, he would think about those training programs and wonder about the men going through them. He would wonder if they knew what they were trading away, if they understood that the competence they were acquiring came at a price, that the skills carved into their nervous systems by fear and pressure would never quite feel like their own. He wanted to warn them somehow, to tell them that you can't unlearn what trauma teaches, can't separate the skill from the horror that produced it. But there was no one to tell, no channel through which such a warning could flow, so he kept silent and hoped that somehow they would figure it out themselves. Part 8. The Nature of Survival Learning. What Thomas Keller experienced in that truck, and what countless other soldiers experienced in countless other situations during the war and every war before and after, represents a fundamental truth about human learning that our educational systems largely ignore. We teach as if learning is a gradual process, a patient accumulation of knowledge through repeated exposure and practice, and for most skills and most contexts, this is adequate. But the human brain has another mode, an emergency protocol that activates when survival is on the line, and this mode operates by entirely different rules. It is fast where traditional learning is slow, permanent where traditional learning is forgettable, and traumatic where traditional learning is merely challenging. The neuroscience underlying this difference has been extensively studied in the decades since Keller's war ended. We now know that the amygdala, when activated by extreme threat, doesn't just produce fear, it actively modulates memory formation in other parts of the brain, essentially tagging experiences as critically important and forcing them into long-term storage with unusual strength. This is why traumatic memories are so vivid, so resistant to forgetting, so prone to triggering overwhelming emotional responses years or even decades after the original event. The same mechanism that makes PTSD so debilitating is the mechanism that allows for rapid skill acquisition under duress. They are not separate phenomena, they are two sides of the same neurological coin. What Keller learned in those 30 miles was not just how to drive, it was a complete recalibration of his relationship with vehicles, with motion, with control and chaos. His brain had formed what psychologists call a conditioned emotional response, where the act of driving became inseparably linked with the physiological state of terror. This is why he could drive competently but never comfortably, why the skill remained but the trauma persisted, why getting behind a wheel for the rest of his life would trigger echoes of that frozen February day. The learning was perfect, indelible, carved into his neural architecture with a kind of permanence that no classroom instruction could ever achieve. But that permanence came at the cost of his peace of mind, his ability to experience driving as anything other than a controlled reenactment of the worst day of his life. The military's attempt to weaponize this process, to deliberately create the conditions that produce traumatic competence, reflects a utilitarian calculation that prioritizes effectiveness over well-being. And in purely practical terms, the calculation works, the training produces capable soldiers, pilots who can handle emergencies, drivers who don't panic under fire, infantry who can function in chaos. But what the training manuals don't adequately address is the long-term cost, the way these rapidly acquired skills carry psychological freight that becomes apparent only years later, when the war is over and the trained response is no longer adaptive, when the hypervigilance that kept you alive in combat makes it impossible to relax in peacetime. Keller understood this in a way that the psychologists studying him never quite could, because he had lived both sides of it, had experienced both the acquisition of traumatic competence and the decades-long aftermath. He knew that the skill was real, that what he'd learned in that truck had genuine utility, that he had saved lives through his panicked improvisation. But he also knew that if given the choice, if he could go back to that moment and choose between remaining an incompetent supply clerk who never learned to drive and becoming a skilled driver who would carry the trauma forever, he wasn't sure which option he would choose. The competence had saved lives, but it had also cost him something essential, some capacity for ease and joy in simple uncomplicated existence. And that cost, he thought, was one that no training manual would ever honestly calculate. Part 9. The Reflection. Thomas Keller died in 1998 at the age of 81 from complications of pneumonia. He'd lived a long life by most standards, had seen his children grow and his grandchildren born, had retired from the hardware store and spent his final years reading and watching television and taking short walks around the neighborhood. Helen had died 5 years earlier, and after her passing Keller had become even more withdrawn, even more silent, as if the anchor that had kept him connected to the present had been cut and he was drifting backward into memory. In the weeks before his death, when he was in the hospital and drifting in and out of consciousness, he sometimes talked about the war. The nurses would hear him muttering about roads and engines and someone named Morrison who needed help. Once, he gripped a nurse's hand with surprising strength and said very clearly, "I never learned to drive, not really, I just learned how to survive," and then lapsed back into fevered sleep. His son, visiting from California, asked the nurses what his father had meant, but they just shook their heads and said sometimes people get confused at the end, mix up memories and dreams and things that never happened. But it wasn't confusion, not exactly. Keller was simply returning to the defining moment of his life, the experience that had shaped everything that came after, and trying one last time to make sense of it, to understand what he had learned and what it had cost him. In his lucid moments, he thought about that day, about the way terror had burned away everything unnecessary and left only the core imperative of continued motion. He thought about Morrison, dead in the ditch, and about the wounded men, most of them gone now too, their deaths just delayed by a few decades. He thought about the psychologists who had interviewed him and the training programs they'd developed and all the other men who had been put through similar experiences, all the other clerks and cooks and mechanics who had been forced to become something else in an instant. And he thought about the question no one had ever quite asked him, the question that cut to the heart of the whole experience. Had it been worth it? Had those 14 saved lives justified the permanent alteration of his own? And the answer, which he'd never spoken aloud to anyone, not even Helen, was that he didn't know, that the question itself might be unanswerable, because how do you weigh one person's psychological wholeness against another person's survival? How do you calculate the value of peace of mind versus the value of life itself? These were moral equations that had no solution, only approximations, only the messy ambiguous reality of choices made in moments when there was no time for choice. In his final hours, the fever broke and he had a period of clarity. His son was sitting beside the bed and Keller looked at him and said, "I want you to know something. About the war. About what happened." And then he told the story, the whole story, from Morrison's death to the arrival at the camp, told it in a quiet, steady voice while his son listened with growing understanding. When he finished, his son was crying and Keller reached out and took his hand and said, "I'm not telling you this because I want sympathy. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that sometimes the things that save us are the things that break us, and we live our whole lives trying to figure out if that's a fair trade. He died 2 days later, quietly, in the early morning when the hospital was still mostly dark and the nurses were changing shifts. There was no drama to it, no final struggle, just a gradual cessation of breathing, a slipping away that felt like surrender. His son arranged a modest funeral, and a handful of people came, mostly neighbors and old customers from the hardware store. There was a flag on the casket because he'd been a veteran, and a young soldier folded it with precise ceremonial movements and presented it to Keller's son, who accepted it with both hands and tried not to think about what his father had told him, about the truck and the road and the price of survival. Closing reflection. This is the truth that War Archives Black has always sought to document, the truth that lives in the spaces between official histories and heroic narratives. War does not just kill, it transforms, and sometimes the transformation is so profound that the person who survives is not really the same person who went in. Thomas Keller learned to drive through hell, but what he really learned was something deeper and darker, something about the plasticity of the human mind under extreme duress, about the way terror can carve new neural pathways faster than any patient instruction, about the cost of competence acquired through trauma. The military understood this, studied it, tried to harness it, and in many ways succeeded. Modern training programs can produce soldiers who function at levels that would have been impossible using traditional methods, can create competence in weeks that used to take years. But what they still haven't solved, what perhaps cannot be solved, is the problem of the aftermath, the years and decades that come after the emergency training, after the war ends, after the immediate threat recedes and all that's left is the scar tissue, the permanent rewiring, the skills that can never be forgotten because they were learned at survival velocity. Keller's story is not unique, it is archetypal, a pattern that has repeated millions of times across every conflict in history. Men and women forced into situations they were not prepared for, forced to acquire skills they never wanted, forced to become capable in ways that would haunt them forever. And the terrible irony is that they succeeded, most of them rose to the challenge and performed the impossible and saved lives and accomplished missions and then came home to discover that the price of that success was a permanent sense of dislocation, a feeling that the peaceful world no longer quite fit, that some essential part of themselves had been left behind on that road, in that moment, when they learned something no one should have to learn. The archive remembers what history forgets. The screaming of engines in the night. The weight of a steering wheel in hands that never wanted to hold one. The distance between who we were and who we had to become. And the long slow years of living with skills we acquired through suffering, carrying competence like a burden, surviving the emergency only to spend the rest of our lives paying for survival. This is not a story about heroism. This is a story about transformation and cost, about what we become when we are forced to become something, about the roads we drive through hell and the parts of ourselves we leave behind on those frozen miles. This is a story about Thomas Keller, supply clerk, who learned to drive one winter day in 1943 and spent the rest of his life wishing he hadn't had to. If you've listened this far, you already know too much. The archives are deep, the stories are endless, and every one of them is true in the way that truth matters, in the way that changes you. Subscribe to War Archives Black and remember, what we learn in fear we carry forever. The mind is the longest battlefield and some wars never end, they just move inside us and continue in silence. This is War Archives Black. The next archive is waiting, and it's darker than you think.